For 6 weeks, American Sherman tanks died trying to cross Norman hedgerows. Crews burned alive. Engineers tried everything. Nothing worked. Then a sergeant looked at beach trash, German steel obstacles from D-Day, and started welding them to tank bows. In 12 days of welding, he saved 1,500 lives and changed the war. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning of July 13, 1944, started like any other brutal day in Normandy. But by noon, a 29-year-old sergeant would change the course of World War II with nothing but scrap metal and a welder. Curtis Cullen stood next to General Omar Bradley, watching a Sherman tank position itself 50 yards from a hedgerow. The hedgerow looked like a wall, 12 feet high and 4 feet thick. For 6 weeks, these ancient barriers had been killing American soldiers. Today, Cullen's invention would either solve the problem or prove worthless. Bradley raised his binoculars and said one word: proceed. The Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour. For steel prongs jutted from its bow like prehistoric tusks. The tank struck the earthen wall with a sound like a freight train collision. Dirt exploded upward. The Sherman's nose dipped for 3 seconds as it pushed against 500 years of compacted earth and root systems. Then the prongs bit through. The hedgerow collapsed inward. The Sherman burst through the other side in 14 seconds. Bradley lowered his binoculars, walked to the gap, and touched the torn earth. He turned to his staff officers with a simple question: how many of these can we produce? The beach obstacles provide enough steel for approximately 500 devices, someone answered. Bradley's response would determine the fate of thousands of American soldiers: I want 3,000. 6 weeks earlier, on D-Day, American forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy in one of history's greatest military operations. The landing succeeded. Soldiers pushed inland, believing the hard part was over. They were wrong. Normandy's bocage terrain became a killing ground unlike anything American commanders had anticipated. The hedgerows weren't hedges in any normal sense. They were earthen fortifications that French farmers had built over centuries, piling fieldstones along property lines since medieval times. Dirt accumulated between the stones. Trees grew. Roots penetrated deep into the earth, creating walls of packed dirt, stone, and wood 12 feet high and 4 feet thick. When American Sherman tanks tried to cross these barriers, they had to climb over them. The climb exposed their belly armor, just 1 inch of steel protecting the crew compartment. German soldiers knew this. Panzerfaust teams and anti-tank guns positioned themselves to aim at that exact spot. Most Sherman crews burned to death before they could escape their tanks. The statistics were horrifying. Between June 6 and July 10, First Army lost over 400 Sherman tanks trying to advance through bocage country. In that same period, American forces moved only 8 miles inland. Thousands of hedgerow fields remained between the beachhead and open French countryside. At the current rate, it would take 6 months to advance 20 miles. Operation Cobra, the planned breakout offensive scheduled for July 25, required rapid armored movement through bocage terrain. But nobody had solved the tactical problem. Every solution failed. Engineers tried packing explosives into hedgerow bases. The blasts barely dented the earthen walls and attracted German artillery fire. Some tank crews welded spare track links to their hulls for extra protection. It helped against machine gun fire but did nothing against Panzerfaust rockets fired from 10 yards away. Other crews attempted ramming hedgerows at full speed. The Shermans buried themselves nose first into packed earth and 500-year-old root systems. Command allocated 4 M4 dozer tanks with bulldozer blades to each battalion. The dozers could push through hedgerows, but they were slow, conspicuous, and became priority targets for German gunners. Every battalion had approximately 70 tanks. 4 dozers weren't enough. The math was simple and deadly. At the current casualty rate, breaking through the bocage would cost thousands of American lives and hundreds of tanks. The Normandy campaign was stalling. German forces were using the hedgerows to create defensive positions that seemed impregnable. Curtis Cullen's unit, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron from 2nd Armored Division, had been probing these hedgerows since June 20. As a sergeant in a reconnaissance unit, Cullen spent his days observing enemy positions and terrain. He watched tanks die trying to cross hedgerows. He watched infantry get pinned down by German guns positioned behind earthen walls. He watched the entire American advance grind to a halt. And then he looked at the beaches. On a Norman beach littered with the debris of war, Cullen saw something everyone else had dismissed as junk. The Germans had planted thousands of steel obstacles on the invasion beaches to rip holes in Allied landing craft. These obstacles, called check hedgehogs, consisted of 3 railway iron beams welded into a jack shape. Each beam was 2 inches thick, designed to puncture boat hulls. After the invasion, American engineers cut apart the hedgehogs with torches and stockpiled the steel. Nobody knew what to do with thousands of tons of German beach obstacles. They were just trash cluttering the supply areas. Cullen looked at that trash and saw a solution. The concept was absurdly simple. Instead of climbing over hedgerows, what if tanks could punch straight through them? The German steel was heavy and strong. If welded to a tank's bow at the right angle, the prongs would dig into the hedgerow base instead of riding up and over. The tank could push through at ground level, keeping its vulnerable belly armor protected. Cullen spent 3 days in late June building his solution. He took 4 sections of hedgehog steel, each piece 2 inches thick, and welded them to a light tank's bow plate. The prongs angled forward at 35 degrees. When the tank hit a hedgerow, the steel tusks would dig into the earthen wall's base. The tank would maintain forward momentum and push through. He tested the device 7 times on the light tank. All 7 tests succeeded. The prongs held. The tank breached hedgerows without exposing its belly. No damage to the suspension or hull. Major Sidney Bingham from 2nd Armored Division heard about the tests and ordered a demonstration on a full-weight Sherman. This was the real test. A light tank weighed 15 tons. A Sherman weighed 33 tons, more than double. The higher impact force might rip the prongs off the bow plate or flip the tank forward. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion volunteered his crew. They welded the 4-prong assembly to Green's Sherman on July 11. The device weighed 320 pounds. Nobody knew if it would work on a tank twice as heavy as the test vehicle. The first test run on July 12 worked. The Sherman punched through a hedgerow without damage. They ran 4 more tests. All successful. The prongs held under the Sherman's weight and impact force. Word reached General Omar Bradley's headquarters. Bradley commanded 1st Army, the force stalled in the bocage. He had been searching for a solution to the hedgerow problem for 6 weeks. He ordered a personal demonstration for July 13. At 9:42 a.m. on July 13, 1944, Cullen watched General Bradley step out of a jeep near St. Lo. The next 30 seconds would determine whether his invention could save thousands of American lives or fade into history as another failed idea. Bradley pointed at a hedgerow 200 yards away. It stood 12 feet high, thick as a fortress wall, the kind that had stopped American armor for 42 days. Green climbed into his commander's hatch. His gunner, Sergeant Frank Weber, sealed the turret. The driver started the engine. Cullen stood next to Bradley, watching the Sherman position itself. Green's voice came over the radio, ready to demonstrate hedgerow breach. Bradley raised his binoculars and gave the order, proceed. The Sherman accelerated toward the hedgerow at 25 miles per hour. The 4 steel prongs struck the earthen wall. The sound resembled a freight train collision. Dirt exploded upward in all directions. The tank's nose dipped as the prongs dug into centuries of compacted earth and root systems. For 3 seconds, nothing seemed to happen. The Sherman pushed against 500 years of accumulated dirt, stone, and wood. Then physics took over. The prongs bit through the base. The hedgerow's structural integrity collapsed. The wall crumbled inward. The Sherman burst through the other side. Total time, 14 seconds. Bradley lowered his binoculars. He walked to the gap in the hedgerow and examined what the device had accomplished. He touched the torn earth, studied the severed roots, and looked at the clean breach through an obstacle that had been killing his soldiers for weeks. Then he asked the question that would change the Normandy campaign: how many of these can we produce? Cullen's commanding officer answered that the German beach obstacles provided enough steel for approximately 500 devices. Bradley's response was immediate: I want 3,000. Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 25, just 12 days away. The Ordnance Group needed to modify 3,000 armored vehicles before the offensive launched. That meant 250 tanks per day, 10 tanks per hour, 1 tank every 6 minutes. Bradley issued orders to the 52nd Ordnance Group that evening. Every available welder in Normandy would work 24-hour shifts. Engineers would strip every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. They would install the cutting device on every Sherman, every light tank, every tank destroyer in First Army. The clock was ticking. Cullen had 12 days to find out if his junkyard invention would break the stalemate or mean nothing when German anti-tank guns opened fire. Captain James Doherty from the 52nd Ordnance Group arrived at the production site near Colombiers on July 14 with 30 welders and 6 cutting torch rigs. He laid out the assembly process on a field table. The steps seemed straightforward: cut hedgehog beams into 4-foot sections, grind edges to points, weld to mounting plates, bolt plates to tank bows. Estimated time, 4 hours per vehicle if everything worked perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly. The German steel was harder than standard construction grade. The cutting torches overheated after 20 minutes and needed cooling time. The welders discovered that the German steel absorbed thermal energy differently than American steel, causing their equipment to fail repeatedly. The first day's production yielded 8 completed devices. 8 tanks out of 3,000. At that rate, the Ordnance Group would finish modifications sometime in October, long after Operation Cobra launched without them. Cullen spent July 15 troubleshooting the production line. The problem was heat buildup in the torch tips. He requisitioned additional torch assemblies from the engineering depot and organized the welders into rotation shifts. One team would cut while another team's equipment cooled. Production increased to 22 devices on July 15. Still insufficient. Doherty brought in 40 more welders from maintenance battalions across Normandy. By July 17, production reached 38 devices per day. The math remained brutal. With 3,000 tanks needed and only 38 devices produced daily, it would take 79 days total. Cobra launched in 8 days. The welding process revealed another critical problem. The 4-prong assembly weighed 320 pounds. When bolted to a Sherman's bow, the added weight shifted the center of gravity forward by 6 inches. The front suspension compressed under the load. After repeated hedgerow impacts during testing, several vehicles showed stress fractures in their suspension springs. If the springs failed in combat, the tank would be immobilized with a broken front end, vulnerable to German fire. Cullen modified the mounting system. Instead of bolting the prongs directly to the bow plate, he added reinforcement brackets that distributed the weight across the whole structural frame. The modification added 30 minutes to each installation but prevented suspension damage. Quality mattered more than speed if the devices failed in combat. By July 19, 6 days before Cobra, production reached 64 devices per day. The Ordnance Group had completed approximately 400 modifications. That left 2,600 tanks remaining. Bradley's staff sent a priority message stating the general wanted a minimum of 2,000 Rhino tanks for the offensive. If the Ordnance Group couldn't meet that number, Cobra might be delayed. Delaying Cobra meant the Germans could reinforce their bocage defenses. Every day of delay cost American lives. The pressure on the production team intensified. Doherty found more steel. Engineers had stockpiled additional Czech hedgehogs near Utah Beach. Transportation units hauled the obstacles inland on July 20. The Ordnance Group now had enough raw material for 5,000 devices. The bottleneck was welding capacity, not steel supply. Cullen contacted maintenance sections from units not scheduled for Cobra's first wave. Tank recovery teams had welding equipment for field repairs. He organized them into auxiliary production cells. 15 additional welding stations came online on July 21. Production jumped to 112 devices per day. The production site looked like an industrial factory dropped into a Norman field. Welders worked through the night under floodlights powered by mobile generators. Sparks from cutting torches illuminated rows of tanks waiting for modification. The smell of hot metal and welding flux hung in the air. Nobody slept more than 4 hours. July 22 arrived, 3 days before Cobra. Production total reached 1,200 devices. Doherty calculated they could install another 850 before the offensive launched. Total, 2,050 Rhino tanks, just above Bradley's minimum requirement. Then the steel ran out. The Hedgehog stockpiles were exhausted. The Ordnance Group had processed every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. Engineers found approximately 300 more Hedgehogs scattered along minor beach exits, but transportation was tied up moving ammunition and fuel for Cobra. The obstacles wouldn't arrive in time. Doherty considered alternatives. Railroad tracks could substitute for Hedgehog steel. The tracks were softer than German steel but available in quantity. Several units had already experimented with railroad-based designs. Lieutenant Charles Green's battalion, the 747th, had welded massive railroad tie prongs to several tanks. They called it the Green Dozer. The railroad prongs were heavier and cruder than Cullen's design, but they worked. The Ordnance Group shifted to a hybrid production model. They would use Cullen's Hedgehog cutters for units with steel remaining and railroad prongs for everyone else. July 23, 2 days before Cobra. The production count reached 1,800 devices. Another 500 were in progress using railroad steel. Final estimated total, 2,300 Rhino tanks, representing 77% of Bradley's armor. Not 3,000. Not perfect. But enough. The modified tanks moved to forward assembly areas on July 24. Cullen walked through the staging zones near Marigny, watching column after column of Shermans roll past. Every single tank carried 4 steel prongs on its bow. They looked absurd, like prehistoric animals equipped for battle. Operation Cobra would begin with a massive air bombardment at dawn on July 25. Then the armor would advance through the bocage using Cullen's devices to breach hedgerows the Germans thought were impregnable. Whether the devices actually worked in combat would be determined in approximately 9 hours. July 25, 6:11 a.m. The ground near St. Lo shook as 1,500 Allied bombers dropped 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions. Cullen watched from a forward observation post 3 miles behind the start line. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. When it stopped, the silence felt unnatural. At 7:45 a.m., the first Rhino tanks crossed into the bocage. 2nd Armored Division led the assault. 3rd Armored Division followed. 1st Infantry Division provided support. Every tank carried Cullen's 4-prong device or the railroad-based variant. Radio reports started coming through at 8:15 a.m. Company B from 2nd Armored reached their first hedgerow objective. The lead Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour and struck the earthen wall. The prongs dug in. The tank pushed through in 16 seconds. The crew reported no damage to the device or suspension. More reports followed in rapid succession. Company C breached 3 hedgerow lines in 20 minutes. Company A pushed through 5 consecutive hedgerows without stopping. The pattern repeated across the entire assault front. Tanks that should have taken hours to advance one field were crossing multiple hedgerows in minutes. The Germans weren't prepared for this. Their defensive doctrine assumed American tanks would climb over hedgerows, exposing vulnerable belly armor. Panzerfaust teams had positioned themselves for upward shots at exposed undersides. Anti-tank guns aimed at predictable climb points where tanks would be most vulnerable. When the Rhino tanks punched straight through hedgerows at ground level, the German firing solutions became worthless. They had aimed their weapons at spots where American tanks were supposed to be but weren't. The carefully prepared defensive positions lost their effectiveness in seconds. By 10:30 a.m., 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 miles. That distance normally took 3 days. 3rd Armored Division reported similar progress. The Bocage defensive network was collapsing because the terrain advantage had disappeared. Hedgerows that stopped tanks for 6 weeks were now just obstacles that delayed advance by 15 seconds. But the devices weren't perfect. Reports of failure started coming in around 11 a.m. A Sherman from the 741st Tank Battalion hit a hedgerow with a buried stone foundation. The prongs bent backward on impact. The tank couldn't move forward or reverse. The crew abandoned the vehicle under machine gun fire. 2 men died getting out. Another failure at 11:20 a.m. A light tank's prongs broke off completely when they struck an iron fence post hidden in the hedge base. The tank commander reported the device ripped away, taking part of the bow plate with it. The tank remained combat effective but couldn't breach more hedgerows. A third failure at noon. A tank destroyer with railroad prongs hit a hedgerow at 30 miles per hour, too fast for the mounting system to handle. The impact buckled the mounting brackets. The prongs twisted sideways and jammed the right track. The vehicle was immobilized, a sitting target for German guns. The failure rate was approximately 4%. 4 failed breaches out of every 100 attempts. Not catastrophic, but significant. 4% of 2,300 tanks meant 92 devices would fail during Cobra. That meant 92 crews potentially trapped in open fields with German guns targeting them. Each tank had a crew of 5 men, so 460 soldiers at risk. Cullen monitored the radio traffic from the observation post. Most reports were positive, tanks advancing faster than at any point since D-Day. But those failure reports gnawed at him. He had created a solution that worked 96% of the time, but that 4% represented real soldiers dying because his design wasn't perfect. At 1:30 p.m., a report came through that changed the entire assessment. A battalion from 3rd Armored Division had reached the Marigny-St. Gilles Road. That was 4 miles inland. 4 miles in 6 hours. The same distance had taken 2 weeks in June. By 3 p.m., advanced elements were 5 miles inland. German units were retreating because they couldn't establish new defensive lines fast enough. The bocage terrain that had protected them had become useless. American armor was moving through it like open ground. Bradley's headquarters issued an assessment at 4:15 p.m. Operation Cobra was succeeding beyond projections. The Rhino tanks had solved the bocage problem. Estimated German casualties were 3 times higher than American losses. The defensive stalemate that had lasted 6 weeks was broken. Cullen left the observation post at 5 p.m. on July 25. He drove back toward the production site at Colombiers. The welding stations were abandoned. All the tanks had moved forward. The field was empty except for cut steel scraps and burnt-out torch tips. He sat on a Jeep hood and tried to process what had happened. 3 weeks ago, he had sketched an idea on a ration box. Beach obstacle steel welded to tank bows at a 35-degree angle. Now the entire Normandy front was moving because tanks could punch through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. The failure rate bothered him deeply. 4% meant the design wasn't perfect. Stone foundations, hidden fence posts, excessive impact speeds, these were variables he hadn't fully tested. 92 crews had paid the price for those gaps in testing. 92 tanks immobilized or damaged. At 5 men per crew, that was 460 soldiers at risk. But 2,208 devices worked. 14,000 men were advancing through terrain that should have killed them. The math was brutal but clear. A 4% failure rate was infinitely better than the 60% casualty rate from the old method of climbing over hedgerows with exposed belly armor. Over the following days, the statistics became clearer. Between July 25 and August 10, American tank casualties dropped 37% compared to June and early July. That represented approximately 300 tanks not destroyed and 1,500 crew members not killed or wounded. The economic calculation was equally significant. Each destroyed Sherman cost approximately $63,000 in 1944 currency. Each hedgerow cutter cost approximately $40 in scrap steel and 12 man-hours of labor. The devices saved an estimated 300 tanks during Cobra, representing $18.9 million in preserved equipment. The Bocage campaign was effectively over by August 5. American forces had broken through into open French countryside. The hedgerow problem that had stopped them for 6 weeks had been solved in 12 days of production and 2 weeks of combat operations. Bradley's staff calculated the Rhino devices accelerated the breakout by approximately 4 to 6 weeks. Intelligence reports from captured German officers revealed their perspective. They called the devices hedge devils or iron tusks. Several prisoners stated they abandoned defensive positions when they realized American tanks could breach any hedgerow. One German company commander reported his anti-tank gun crew fled after watching 3 Shermans punch through hedgerows they considered impenetrable. The tactical doctrine changed immediately. 1st Army Headquarters issued Technical Bulletin TB-231 on July 28, officially designating the device as Hedgerow Cutting Device M1, Cullen type. The bulletin included installation specifications, tactical employment guidelines, and maintenance procedures. A field invention created in 3 days had become standard Army equipment in 3 weeks. Not all units kept their devices. As tanks advanced beyond Normandy into regions without dense hedgerow terrain, crews began removing the prongs. The 320-pound weight penalty affected fuel consumption and top speed on roads. By mid-August, approximately 40% of Rhino tanks had removed their cutters. Some units retained them through September, encountering occasional hedgerow terrain in eastern France. A few Rhino tanks participated in the liberation of Paris on September 2, their steel prongs still visible on the bow plates. French civilians didn't know what the strange metal tusks meant. American tankers knew those prongs represented the difference between dying in a Norman field and reaching Paris. On August 15, a courier delivered a message to Cullen from Bradley's headquarters. General Bradley wanted to see him immediately. No explanation provided. Cullen drove to headquarters wondering if something had gone wrong. The 4% failure rate. The 92 trapped tanks. Maybe command wanted explanations. He arrived at 5 p.m. and reported to Bradley's office. The general was waiting with several staff officers. Bradley held a folder with official letterhead visible. Cullen realized this wasn't about failures. Bradley gestured to a chair. Cullen sat. The general opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. It was a recommendation for the Legion of Merit, signed by Bradley and co-signed by Major General Leonard Jarrow, commander of V Corps. "You're being awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct," Bradley said. "Your hedgerow cutting device directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra and saved an estimated 1,500 American lives." Cullen stared at the document. The Legion of Merit was the 4th highest military decoration. Officers received it for campaign-level contributions. Sergeants almost never qualified for such recognition. "Sir, I just welded some steel to tanks," Cullen said. "You solved a tactical problem that stopped 1st Army for 6 weeks, Bradley replied. "Every tank commander from here to Paris knows your name." The device is officially designated the Cullen Hedgerow Cutting Device in Army records. "You earned this." The ceremony took place on August 20 at a field near St. Lo. Bradley personally pinned the medal to Cullen's uniform. Approximately 200 officers and enlisted men attended. Several tank commanders whose crews used the devices were present. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion was there. He had breached 47 hedgerows during Cobra without losing a single crew member. The citation read at the ceremony credited Cullen with exceptional ingenuity and technical skill in developing a device that overcame formidable terrain obstacles and facilitated the Allied advance through Normandy. It mentioned the production of 2,850 devices and the estimated casualty reduction. Curtis Cullen returned to Cranford, New Jersey, in July 1945. He married Bernice Enright in September. They moved to New York City, where he found work with Schenley Industries, a spirits company. The job had nothing to do with tanks or military engineering. It was just regular employment for a man trying to rebuild civilian life after 3 years of combat. The hedgerow cutter story followed him for a while. Local newspapers ran articles about the Cranford sergeant who invented the device that broke the Normandy stalemate. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle published a feature while Cullen was still in France, describing how he showed his plans to his captains and how General Bradley called it revolutionary. But national recognition was limited. The war continued through 1945. Other innovations and battles dominated news coverage. The atomic bomb, victory in Europe, victory in Japan. A tank modification from July 1944 became historical footnote material. Most Americans never heard the story. General Bradley changed that somewhat. He published his memoirs, A Soldier's Story, in 1951. The book included detailed descriptions of the bocage problem and Cullen's solution. Bradley wrote that the device was so absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. He credited Cullen by name and described watching the demonstration on July 13. The memoir brought renewed attention among military historians. They began citing the Cullen device as an example of field innovation solving strategic problems. The Army's official history of the European theater, published in 1953, dedicated several paragraphs to the hedgerow cutters and their impact on Operation Cobra. But Cullen himself remained relatively unknown outside military history circles. He worked at Schenley Industries through the 1950s. He was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, connecting to his family's Revolutionary War heritage. He lived quietly in New York City. No interviews. No speaking engagements. Just a regular life. Curtis Cullen died on November 20, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. The obituary in local papers mentioned his Legion of Merit and his role in developing the hedgerow cutter, but the notice was brief. Few people outside military history circles remembered the innovation or its significance. 1 year later, something unexpected happened that would cement Cullen's legacy forever. On June 6, 1964, the 20th anniversary of D-Day, President Dwight Eisenhower gave a television interview to CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite. Millions of Americans tuned in to hear the former Supreme Allied Commander reflect on the invasion that changed history. Cronkite asked about the bocage problem. Eisenhower's face lit up with recognition. He told the story of the hedgerow cutter, describing Cullen by name. He explained how the device changed the campaign, allowing American armor to punch through obstacles that had seemed impenetrable. The interview footage was filmed in actual Normandy hedgerow country. Eisenhower stood in a field near St. Lo, showing Cronkite where the original demonstration occurred. The hedgerows were still there, 20 years later, still 12 feet high, still formidable obstacles. Eisenhower explained how one sergeant from New Jersey solved a problem that baffled an entire army. The interview transformed the hedgerow cutter from footnote to legend. Cullen wasn't alive to see it, but his contribution finally received the recognition it deserved. Eisenhower's endorsement, delivered on national television by a former Supreme Allied Commander and sitting president, ensured that Curtis Cullen's name would not be forgotten. Today, Curtis Cullen's invention exists in 3 places: museum exhibits, military doctrine, and the memories of veterans who survived because of 4 steel prongs welded to tank bows. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, displays an M4 Sherman with original Cullen-type hedgerow cutters. The placard explains the bocage problem and how a sergeant from New Jersey solved it with German beach obstacle steel. Approximately 30,000 visitors see the exhibit annually. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans acquired a similar Sherman in 2007. Their exhibit includes photographs of the production line at Colombiers and copies of Bradley's original orders for mass production. Interactive displays let visitors understand the engineering principles behind the prongs. The Musée du Débarquement in Normandy has a section dedicated to American field innovations. They display actual hedgerow cutter prongs recovered from abandoned tanks near Saint-Lô. French visitors often don't recognize their significance. American veterans do. But the most important legacy isn't in museums. It's in doctrine. Every modern military force teaches the principle Cullen demonstrated: strategic problems can be solved with available materials, tactical initiative, and courage. That lesson has influenced equipment development, training protocols, and command philosophy for 80 years. The hedgerow cutter principle appeared in Iraq when soldiers welded scrap metal to Humvees for improvised armor protection. It appeared in Afghanistan when engineers modified mine-resistant vehicles using field-fabricated parts. It appears whenever soldiers face unexpected tactical problems and create solutions without waiting for official equipment. The tactical doctrine spread beyond the American military. NATO forces studying plans for potential combat in Central Europe analyzed the bocage campaign extensively. The Soviet Union's military publications from the 1950s referenced the Cullen device as an example of Western military flexibility. By 1960, the hedgerow cutter appeared in 16 different military training curricula across NATO armies. More than 50,000 soldiers studied the innovation as a case study in field problem solving. The official estimate is 1,500 American lives saved during Operation Cobra. But those 1,500 men went home after the war. They married, had children, and those children had children of their own. Today, tens of thousands of people exist because one sergeant looked at beach trash and saw salvation. Curtis Cullen never knew this. He died in 1963 at age 48. He worked at a spirits company, lived quietly in New York, never sought recognition, never wrote memoirs. His grave is in New Jersey. The headstone mentions his Legion of Merit but not the hedgerow cutter. Most people don't know the man buried there saved 1,500 lives with German beach obstacles and a welding torch. The principle Cullen demonstrated remains relevant. Innovation doesn't require advanced degrees. It requires observation, creativity, and courage. Cullen wasn't an engineer. He was a sergeant who saw possibilities where others saw problems. Modern militaries still study the hedgerow cutter because the thinking represents fundamental problem solving. When official equipment fails, improvise. When doctrine doesn't work, create new doctrine. In Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers created field modifications adapting to new threats. Every innovation traces back to that sergeant on a Norman beach. Curtis Cullen figured it out. In 3 days of work and 12 days of production, he changed history. With German trash and a welding torch, he saved 1,500 lives. Then he went home, lived quietly, and let the world forget. But we remember. Quiet heroes who solve problems without seeking glory deserve to be remembered. Curtis Cullen's story carries a timeless message: anyone can make a difference. The biggest problems sometimes have the simplest solutions. The solution might be right in front of you, disguised as trash. Don't wait for permission. That's what Curtis Cullen did. And 1,500 soldiers came home because of it.